Market shifts are constant. Sometimes they happen slowly, almost imperceptibly, like water dripping from a faucet, one drop at a time, until one day you look down and you realize there's a hole where a solid surface used to be. Oftentimes, the shift feels sudden. You blink and something is different. What worked yesterday doesn't quite land the same way today. No matter how they show up, the reality is this: market shifts are always happening. The challenge is that marketers often get comfortable with their existing playbooks, the ones they've been running, refining, and optimizing for years until they can execute them flawlessly, almost on autopilot. Now that works until the playbook built for a smooth, flat surface suddenly hits that hole created by years of unnoticed change, or until the strategy that worked seamlessly last year falls flat because something fundamental in the market has moved, even if only by a few inches. So what's a brand to do? The answer isn't to panic, and it's not chasing every shiny new tactic. It's awareness. It's being vigilant, paying attention to how the market is changing, and evolving your growth strategy to match what exists now, not what used to work. So after this short break, I'm going to walk you through 5 marketplace shifts I've been watching closely over the past few years, shifts that have grown too big for brands to ignore. If growth and relevance matter to you in 2026, these are the changes you need to understand.
HubSpot helped Tumblr solve a really big problem. They needed to move fast to produce trending content, but their marketing team was stuck waiting on engineers to code every single email campaign. Now they use HubSpot's customer platform to email real-time trending content to millions of users in just seconds. The impact? 3 times more engagement and double the content creation. Want to move faster like Tumblr? Visit HubSpot.com.
Now, the first marketplace shift reshaping brand growth in 2026 and beyond is this: trust has become a growth constraint. In a market with endless choice, trust is now the limiting factor for growth. Today, trust isn't a nice to have, it's the currency consumers use to decide which brands they're willing to engage with and which ones they're willing to buy from. At its most basic level, trust starts with reliability. Does your brand do what it says it's going to do? When something goes wrong, can customers expect you to resolve it fairly and consistently? But trust doesn't stop there. Consumers are also evaluating whether they trust your intent, not just your execution. Do your values align with theirs? Do you treat people who are like them with respect? Do you treat people who aren't like them with respect? Do you show up for communities they care about, especially when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient? In many ways, trust in brands works the same way trust works in real relationships. It might begin with a transaction, but it grows over time through repeated experiences that reinforce you can count on me. And just as importantly, trust is not something you earn once and keep forever. It requires ongoing effort, consistency, reinforcement, care, because once trust is broken, growth slows or stops entirely. If consumers don't trust you, they won't buy from you, and no amount of marketing can compensate for that. So here's how trust is actually built. It isn't abstract. It's created through very tangible signals, including volume, such as repeated exposure and interaction, consistency, like doing the right thing over and over again, reputation in terms of what others are saying about you when you're not in the room, and experience, how customers feel every time they interact with your brand. Think about how this shows up in real life. I sometimes buy products from Amazon, not because they're the best, but because I trust that if something goes wrong, Amazon will make it right, even when the issue isn't technically their fault. That trust lowers friction in my decision-making. This morning, I was talking to my husband about quinceañera dresses for my niece. She's going to be visiting soon from Argentina with her parents and wants to buy the dress here. I immediately recommended a store I've personally bought formal dresses from, including my wedding dresses, multiple times, David's Bridal. Why? Because I trust the experience and because going into the store reduces risk and you can see how the dress actually looks rather than guessing online. I had a similar experience recently when shopping for hair products. I spent time reading reviews, specifically looking for feedback from people like me. Seeing their success helped me trust that the product would work for me. And I've also walked away from purchases after seeing credible feedback from others about negative outcomes. All of that is trust at work. Now, here's an important nuance to be clear about. Trust does not look the same for every consumer. Identity plays a real role in how people evaluate trust, what they prioritize, what risks they perceive, and what signals they look for before deciding whether to engage with a brand. So it's not enough to think about trust as a single uniform thing. Brands need to be intentional about how trust is earned across the different identities and lived experiences of the customers they want to serve. For example, when I used to travel solo, trust showed up primarily as a question of safety. Could I trust this brand, whether it was a hotel or a transportation service or a tour, to prioritize my safety? That consideration carried real weight in my decision making. For male travelers or for people traveling with families or friends, that same question might not be as central, or it may show up differently. Their trust calculus might prioritize convenience, reliability, or comfort instead. And here's the consequence brands need to understand. If I can't trust you to have my identity-specific needs in mind, I'll have to go elsewhere. That's not a threat, it's a practical decision consumers make every single day. So what does this mean for growth? If trust is a growth constraint, and it is, then brands need to ask a deeper question. Whose version of trust are we designing for? Because sustainable growth doesn't come from assuming trust is universal. It comes from understanding how trust is built, tested, and reinforced across the diverse identities of your customers, and designing experiences that meet those expectations consistently. In today's market, trust isn't just part of the strategy, it's the constraint that determines how far your growth can actually go. All right, so here's the second marketplace shift reshaping brand growth. And that's the way people discover brands has fractured. Now, there was a time when discovery followed relatively predictable paths. You made media buys in the right channels, and if your budget was big enough, awareness and demand followed. First, it was TV, radio, and print, then paid search, then Facebook and Instagram ads, then TikTok ads, then podcast and newsletter ads. And to be clear, I'm not anti-ads. Paid media is still a viable way to reach people at scale. But consumer behavior and preferences have changed, and so has the way trust is built. Today, discovery no longer happens through a single dominant channel or even a small set of them. It happens across many fragmented touchpoints, often outside of brand control. People search less in traditional search engines and more through AI tools. They spend less time scrolling ad-heavy platforms and increasingly pay for subscriptions specifically to avoid ads on platforms like YouTube and Spotify. At the same time, one of the strongest trust signals we talked about earlier, reputation, has become central to discovery. People aren't just asking, what should I buy? They're asking, what are people like me using? I've personally bought various products based on content I've seen on TikTok, not from TikTok shop promotions, but from people sharing their real experiences or simply showing how they do things in their everyday lives. For example, there was a moment when weighted vests started showing up all over social media, especially among women talking about walking, bone density, weight loss, and overall health. I saw post after post. I heard doctors that I follow online mention it. That's how I learned the product even existed. Later on, I ended up getting a weighted vest that worked for me, and I still use it today. Now, that same thing happened with cottage cheese. A product that's been around like forever suddenly took off again because people on TikTok started talking about how easy it was to hit their protein goals, and it was a very low-calorie addition to what they were eating. And just like that, it was flying off the shelves, including in my household. I even read some things that there was a shortage of cottage cheese because demand increased so much. That's discovery today. It doesn't start with a brand message. It starts with people. Now, there's another pattern embedded in all of this that brands can't afford to miss. Increasingly, discovery happens through people like me. The content that introduced me to weighted vests didn't come from brands. It came from women in their 40s, women focused on staying healthy, strong, and active as they age. The renewed interest in cottage cheese didn't come from a new campaign. It came from women in their 30s and 40s talking about easy ways to increase protein and support their health goals. That context matters, and those are the people who were buying these products. People aren't just discovering products through anyone, they're discovering them through people who share similar identities, life stages, priorities, and lived experiences. When consumers see someone who feels familiar, someone who looks like them, lives like them, or is navigating similar goals, trust transfers more easily. That's why these recommendations land, and it's why generic discovery strategies aren't working the way they used to. So what does this mean for your growth? The mistake that many brands are making is continuing to optimize for a discovery model that no longer exists. They double down on the same channels, they repeat the same playbooks, they assume attention can still be bought the way it used to be, but in a fractured discovery environment, growth comes from presence across ecosystems, not dominance in a single channel. So if discovery increasingly happens through people like me, then brands need to rethink how they show up. This isn't just about influencer marketing. It's about understanding who your customers see themselves in and where those conversations are already happening. Growth comes from designing for relevance, not just reach, enabling credibility through trusted voices, letting discovery travel through real communities, not just paid placements. Because if people can't find you or don't hear about you from sources they trust, it doesn't matter how good your product is. Discovery has changed, and brand growth strategies need to change with it. All right, so after this short break, we're going to get into the remaining 3 shifts that you really need to pay close attention to if you want to grow in 2026 and beyond.
Okay, I've got another podcast recommendation for you. It's Marketing Against the Grain, hosted by Kip Bodnar and Kieran Flanagan, and it's brought to you by the HubSpot Podcast Network, the audio destination for business professionals. If you want to know what's happening now in marketing, what's ahead, and how you can lead the way, this is the podcast for you. I've listened to this show several times, and I can tell you that I have sent episodes of this show to people in my network, and they have gotten great value out of it because it was on topics that are super highly relevant today. If you want to check out a recent episode to pique your interest, check out My Data Proves SEO is Not Dead, plus how to rank #1 on Google and AI. It's a super practical show where you'll get lots of no fluff insight. So I definitely recommend checking it out. Listen to Marketing Against the Grain wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, marketplace shift number 3 is that relationships are no longer optional. Now, because trust has become a growth constraint and discovery has fractured, consumers are no longer satisfied with purely transactional relationships. People want more than a product. They want a relationship with the brands they choose to engage with and buy from. And here's the key shift brands need to understand. It's not always buy first, build a relationship later. Increasingly, it's the opposite. Build the relationship first, and it becomes easier to buy later. Think about it the same way you might think about personal relationships. Many of the strongest partnerships are built on a foundation of trust, familiarity, and shared values, not just a single transaction. That same dynamic is now showing up in how people choose brands. Brand relationships don't form through slogans or campaigns alone. They're built through ongoing participation in people's lives. That can look like experiences that integrate into daily life, experiences that don't just promote a product, but actively make people's lives better. A great example is Crayola's Creativity Week, which we explored in depth in episode number 198. I'll drop a link to that in the show notes for you so you can have a listen to that interview with Crayola's CMO in case you haven't listened already. She dropped some really wonderful gems. Now, Crayola's Creativity Week, it's not about selling crayons in the moment. It's about becoming a trusted partner in learning, creativity, and childhood development. That kind of presence builds a relationship long before a purchase decision happens. Another way is by helping people grow, learn, or access opportunity. Teaching someone how to do something, helping them unlock new possibilities, removing friction from their lives. When brands invest in people this way, they stop feeling transactional and start feeling supportive. Another way to build relationships is showing up and interacting like a real participant. Sometimes relationship building looks simple. It looks like brands showing up on social media, listening, responding, laughing, engaging, not broadcasting, but participating. This is what happens when brands kiki with people online, when they're present in culture, not hovering above it. Another relationship builder, listening and acting on what people are asking for, Strong relationships are built on being heard. We've seen this when Glamour responded directly to audience demand and put influencers Nick Alandria on the cover of their December issue. We've seen it with Netflix when they leaned into the combination of Bridgerton and influencer Alandria fandom. And it worked. Fans loved it, not because it was in a deck, but because they understood the culture and the conversation that was happening by consumers online. And they leaned into it, and fans, including me, ate it up. Now, you can't do that unless you are paying attention to what is actually happening out there. Being present in and elevating communities is another way to build relationships. Some brands do it by honoring the communities that they serve. Ralph Lauren's work with the Oaks Bluffs line that they didn't just sell clothing. It surfaced history, culture, and pride within the Black community. It told people, we see you, and your story and your history matters. Solving real problems is another wonderful way to build relationships. MasterCard's True Name card gave transgender people the ability to use a name that reflects who they are, a simple but powerful signal of recognition and respect. That's not just a feature, that's relationship building. So what does all this mean for growth? When relationships become the foundation, growth stops being purely transactional. Brands that invest in relationships earn trust earlier, reduce friction in decision-making, build loyalty that outlasts campaigns, and creates preference that competitors can't easily replicate. In today's market, people don't just buy from brands they recognize, they buy from brands they feel connected to. And in 2026 and beyond, relationships aren't a bonus. They're a prerequisite for sustainable growth. All right, so the fourth marketplace shift reshaping brand growth is this. The quote-unquote general market is breaking down. For a long time, brands relied on mainstream media as an efficient way to reach the largest possible audience. The logic was simple. Speak to the biggest group of people with one unified message and get the most bang for your buck. And for a while, that approach worked. But the idea of a single quote-unquote general market has always left a lot of people out. Not everyone fit neatly into that bucket. And as a result, many consumers, especially those from underrepresented and underserved communities, had to do extra work to decide whether products, messaging, or experiences would actually work for them. That extra work created friction. They were trying to make one-size-fits-all offering works for people, needs, and identities those offerings weren't designed for. A one-size-fits-all simply can't compete with something that feels tailor-made and intentional. That's where the market is heading now. People are tired of adapting themselves to brands. They're gravitating towards brands that adapt to them. Now, here's an important dynamic brands need to understand. When a brand speaks directly to a specific identity or lived experience, especially one that's been historically underrepresented and underserved, it lands more deeply because it's still so uncommon. For many communities, being explicitly considered is the exception, not the norm. That's why moments of specificity feel meaningful. They signal intention. They say, you weren't an afterthought. That's exactly why an Amazon Alexa ad that I saw years ago still stands out to me. The ad featured a dark-skinned Black woman with natural hair. Now, I remember it clearly, not because it was flashy, but because it was rare. It told me, we see you. You were considered. And here's the nuance that matters, especially. That ad was still a general market ad. Like, it aired during the Super Bowl. It wasn't niche media. It wasn't a limited campaign. It wasn't exclusionary. It was simply designed with a specific person in mind, me, and that specificity didn't alienate the masses. It made the brand feel more human and more memorable. The shift away from the quote-unquote general market doesn't mean brands have to abandon scale. Often it means rethinking how scale is designed. You don't have to speak to everyone the same way. You don't have to flatten people into averages. You don't have to choose between relevance and reach. Sometimes growth comes from small, intentional tweaks, designing messages, experiences, and representing people in a way that allows specific people to feel seen within broader platforms. That's not inefficiency, that's modern relevance. So what does this mean for growth for you? Relationships aren't built on general. They're built on the specific. Specificity reduces friction, signals care, builds trust faster, and it creates emotional resonance competitors can't easily replicate. Brands that take the time to acknowledge how consumers are different and design with those differences in mind build stronger, healthier businesses. Businesses that serve multiple audiences without flattering them, reduce friction instead of shifting it onto customers, create connection without abandoning scale. This shift doesn't require brands to work differently, but it does challenge old ideas about efficiency. The payoff is real because in today's market, more specific leads to less friction. Less friction leads to stronger relationships, and stronger relationships lead to more sustainable growth. And that leads us to the fifth and final market shift happening that we're going to talk about today that is reshaping brand growth and is very closely connected to the one before it. They go hand in hand. Consumers are rejecting assimilation. At a fundamental level, people are tired of having to shed important parts of themselves just to fit in because brands haven't designed products, services, or experiences that account for their realities. For a long time, consumers were expected to adapt to brands, to change how they spoke, how they showed up, how they wore their hair, how they behaved, how they navigated systems that weren't built with them in mind. That adaptation created friction, but people tolerated it because they didn't have many alternatives. That's no longer the case. Here's what this looks like in practice. A few weeks ago, I was in Walmart and noticed something small but very telling. Hanging from the rafters were signs promoting these sales that they had coming up. The first sign that I saw was in Spanish. The next one was in English. Now, that was a very intentional choice. In our area, many Walmart shoppers speak Spanish. You hear it every time you're in the store. Walmart could have easily said, hey, everything is in English. Customers will figure it out. Instead, they made a different decision. They acknowledged who their customers are and communicated in a way that signaled you don't need to change who you are to belong here. Now, most things in Walmart are still in English, but that small shift sent a powerful message. You are welcome here as you are. So why does this matter for growth? This isn't just about language. The same dynamic shows up for people who wear larger sizes, people who speak languages other than English, neurodivergent consumers, parents with kids who behave like kids, LGBTQ plus consumers, anyone who's historically been asked to, quote unquote, adjust themselves to fit the system. Today's consumers feel far less pressure to conform. Sometimes it's because they're demanding for more and they're leaning more into their identity. But another factor that plays into this is they finally have options. When people have choice, they stop forcing themselves into experiences that weren't designed for them. They go where friction is lower. Assimilation creates friction, and friction kills growth. In today's market, brands that require customers to adapt, to translate, to code switch, to minimize parts of themselves, they are pushing people away. Drip by drip by drip by drip by drip. And sometimes like they're giving them a big old push. The brands that grow consistently are the ones that remove that friction, not by trying to be everything to everyone, but by designing experiences that say, you don't have to change to belong here. When customers don't feel like they have to assimilate, trust builds faster, relationships deepen, discovery accelerates, and growth becomes easier. In 2026 and beyond, growth doesn't come from asking consumers to fit your system. It comes from building systems that fit the people you want to serve. Now, if there's one thing I want you to take away from today's episode, it's this. Growth today is all about responding to a very different set of conditions. Trust has become a constraint. Discovery has fractured. Relationships are no longer optional. The general market is breaking down and consumers are rejecting assimilation. None of these shifts exist in isolation. They reinforce each other. And together, they are reshaping what sustainable brand growth and what your brand growth strategy actually looks like. The brands that will win in 2026 won't be louder. They won't rely on outdated playbooks, and they won't ask customers to do all the work. They'll remove friction. They'll build trust intentionally. They'll meet people where they are without asking them to change who they are. That's what frictionless growth looks like now. If you're listening to this and wondering where your brand is creating friction without realizing it, I've built a quick assessment to help you figure it out. It's 2 to 3 minutes max, and you can find it at frictionlessgrowthlab.com/quiz. I'll also drop a link to it in the show notes for you below so you can access it easily. Until next time, remember, growth accelerates when you remove friction for your customers, for your team, and for your business. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you soon.